Okay, let's talk a little bit about building muscle and what it takes, what the science shows, what the people that apply the science know. So, having done the HPO podcast now for well over a year, I've had the opportunity to talk with a number of people that basically are experts in this subject, including world-renowned scientists like Dr. Stuart Phillips, Dr. Don Layman, who just came on the show the other day. We've also had some top bodybuilders, guys like Stan Efferding, and professional bodybuilder John Anderson. So these guys apply the science, and they're guys that do the science. And so this is what the synthesis of what they've told me, and I think I'll lay this out for you guys. So first of all, this does not have to do with health, does not have to do with longevity, does not have to do with athletic performance. This is strictly in the context of building muscle. Okay, and so let's talk about what we need to do from diet and training to get us there. So from a dietary standpoint, the principal driver of muscle synthesis is going to be protein. All right, so how much protein? Science tells us typically 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram seems to be the amount most people need to maximize muscle protein synthesis. Beyond that, the benefits seem to taper off. Although we don't have a good study done in carnivorous people, so that may not completely be true. But for general population, those numbers seem about to be the same. And again, there are going to be some exceptions and outliers and all this stuff. But again, these are general concepts. Some people may say beyond 2.2, even a little more. So protein for sure, all right? And we also, when we want to activate muscle protein synthesis, we have to stimulate mTOR. And to do that adequately or efficiently, then we need to get, it seems to be leucine, seems to be the key driver in that particular part of the equation. And so leucine needs to be consumed in an amount of about 2.5 to 3 grams at a time to stimulate mTOR, which is going to drive muscle protein synthesis. Now, we know that just as a comparison, animal source proteins tend to be much higher in leucine than plant source proteins. We also know that animal source proteins are more bioavailable than plant source proteins. Typically, in animal source, if we call that 100%, a plant source might get us 60% from a bioavailability standpoint. And then again, the amino acid content is not ideal on a plant-based diet. It's not that you can't do it, but it's just harder. So we have to have enough protein to get leucine, and we have to have enough per body weight, to drive muscle protein synthesis. And so that is one of the things we have to do. Now let's talk about insulin. So a lot of people believe that eating carbohydrates drives muscle protein synthesis or prevents muscle protein breakdown due to the interaction with insulin. While it is true that having insulin will permissively allow anabolism or muscle protein synthesis, and insulin will also help to limit catabolism or muscle protein breakdown, the amount of insulin that is derived from a protein sourced meal without carbohydrate is completely sufficient to do that job with regards to insulin. Carbohydrates do not add to that in any appreciable way. That's what the research shows. So we need to get insulin to a degree. We need to get enough protein. Carbohydrates are not going to do anything for muscle protein synthesis. Now, why do some people use carbohydrates? So the other part of the equation is a caloric surplus. So we need to be in a calorie surplus to gain muscle. All right, and one of the easiest ways to do it for many people is carbohydrates, because it's easier to eat more calories in carbohydrates in many cases than it is in protein, particularly things like meat. And so that's why one of the reasons people say, they eat a lot of meat, but they've got to add, or they eat a lot of protein, but they sometimes add carbohydrates there. And so it's not that the carbohydrates are doing anything special with regard to insulin or anything like that, but they are allowing for that caloric surplus to happen a little easier. Again, we're talking about muscle protein synthesis, guys. So you can eat adequate protein, then you've got to get more calories, beyond that. And you can get that from more protein, from more fat, or from more carbohydrate. And we can argue about, which is the best way to do that. There's certainly some people where carbohydrates are problematic, and it may not be the carbohydrates, but maybe the food that carbohydrates come in. That is to say, many carbohydrate-containing foods also contain compounds that can be irritating, bloating of the gut, so on and so forth. So beyond that, we talk about glycogen restoration in recovery and performance. Again, I don't want to get too much into performance, but one of the interesting things we know is certainly carbohydrates are very effective at refilling glycogen stores. Now, interesting, and this is something Dr. Lehman shared with us the other day on the podcast, is it's very interesting that in these are animal models, animals that are on high protein diets relative to lower protein diets. So if we look at an animal that's on a high carbohydrate diet, what they'll see is overnight their glycogen stores, particularly if their protein is not particularly high, their glycogen stores will deplete pretty significantly overnight. And then in the morning they're very hungry, and so they have to refill it up with carbohydrates. But if animals are on high protein diets, even in the absence of significant carbohydrates, what we see is overnight they do not deplete their glycogen to the extent that a high carb animal would do. So that has the implication that if you're eating plenty of protein, the carbohydrates may not be necessary for restoring the glycogen stores. And that is probably one of the reasons we see a lot of people on a carnivore style diet still performing well, particularly as they adapt and still being able to put on muscle and getting stronger and those sorts of things. Okay, another concept, and again, I'm talking, and all this stuff, and even though I've got Stan Efferding and John Anderson as sources here, and those guys obviously use performance-enhancing drugs, and they're not, they're happy to admit that, still the same things sort of apply. But in the natural state, in the unsupplemented state, and this goes to insulin, that's why for some reason bodybuilders inject insulin. That may have an effect. Again, I'm talking about natural people here and building muscle naturally. But when we look at testosterone levels, as Stuart Phillips pointed out in his 2018 paper, in a natural athlete, your testosterone level, whether it's free or total, does not seem to be the main driver of muscle protein synthesis. That is to say, your testosterone can be 300 or it can be 800 if you're natural. It doesn't matter. What does seem to matter is androgen receptor density. And so that is why we see many athletes with relatively lower testosterone that still are very strong and very muscular and able to perform well. All right. So the other thing we talk about is meal frequency. So in general, you are going to stimulate muscle protein synthesis as long as you get an adequate amount of protein in, sometime in the day after training. Now, to maximize things, you may find that eating a protein source closer to a training session, particularly afterwards, is going to give you a little bit more advantage. Not a tremendous amount, but some. Also, we talked about muscle protein synthesis, spiking mTOR in the context of getting in leucine, via protein. Again, probably doing that more frequently throughout the day, all things like John Anderson, who, eats up to 10 times a day, is going to stimulate more muscle protein synthesis. Again, this is not in context of longevity, health, or anything like that. We just have to, separate those two components. So, in short, the things we need to do. Oh, the other thing we need to talk about is training. So, we need to do resistance training. Okay, how heavy, how light. So the current research seems to suggest that as long as you're lifting at least 40% of a 1 rep max, so if you were benching 300 pounds, at least using 120 pounds, you need to recruit as many muscle fibers as possible. And you do that by going very, very heavy, close to 1 rep max, limit lifts, 80, 85, 90% with several reps, or you can do 40% submaximal lifts to failure. So high reps, high volume. And so either of those strategies seems to work. It's my preference to do both. So in short, how do you put on muscle? 1, get adequate protein. 2, get adequate leucine. 3, resistance train to recruit maximal muscle fiber recruitment. You need to get meals in probably more frequently, get meals in shortly after training. Adequate rest is also in there. I forgot to mention that, but rest is essential. You need to get a calorie surplus. And then obviously to maximize, if you're willing to go there, then drugs become the other huge factor. But again, so anyway, all those things apply. I think it's very interesting information. So protein, adequate leucine, meal frequency, meal timing, and calorie surplus, and then the training and the recovery. So that's it, guys. That's what the research shows. That's what the application from the people that do that. When Stan Efferding's coming out on the podcast tomorrow, we went into a long discussion about that. His vertical diet does just that. It is plenty of protein. It's plenty of leucine. It is plenty of calories, and that's why he talks about adding things like rice and dextrose to stimulate appetite to get people to eat enough. That is the key reason why he is using carbohydrates in the diet. It's not because carbohydrates magically build muscle, but it's just to allow a caloric surplus, which is sometimes hard to do. It can be hard to eat 5-6 pounds of meat a day. I do it, and it's not the easiest thing. But again, if you want to go that route as a carnivore, you're going to have to do all those things. You're going to have to eat more frequently. You're going to have to eat a lot. You're going to have to get into a caloric surplus. You're going to have to eat probably soon after a workout, probably within 2 hours. I think it doesn't have to be 30 minutes, but probably within 2 hours. You're going to have to resistance train. You're going to have to get adequate sleep and recovery. Okay, guys, hope this is helpful, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.